Hello, friends, fellow deviants. Welcome to Topography, the podcast exploring the contours of design spaces, be they physical, social, digital, or purely imagined. I am your host, Ashley Hoden. Today I'm talking with Lloyd Kahn, the founder of Shelter Publications. He, in the past, has published several widely selling books about DIY home building and fitness, and he pursues both of those interests in his own life with just as much passion as he pursues in publishing. He speaks of himself as a communicator above and beyond all else, and he publishes the Gimme Shelter newsletter, and he also has an Instagram account where he shares the things that interest him, and a lot of people send him photos from their lives that he publishes there as well. His most recent book is Rolling Homes, Shelter on Wheels, and he is in the process of completing a book that offers an alternative take on the Summer of Love in San Francisco, 1967-68. And as an insider who was living in that culture at the time and saw it from his own unique and different way. And so I'm very curious about that. He's sharing a lot of information about the types of things that arrived in the 60s that were new, technologies, tools, just how life changed. Anyhow, it sounds very interesting. The conversation was very interesting and inspiring, and he, to my eye, is somewhat of a master of pursuing your interests and your beliefs and forming a life around those interests and beliefs. So thank you very much. And just a publication note, this is available on video on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify. It's on audio through Apple, Amazon, most of the podcatchers of note. And like us, review us, and recommend us to everybody you possibly can. Anyhow, thank you. One of the, in finding about you and your work and your life, one of the things that kind of has stuck out from just initially looking at your books and your Instagram feed, which is really compelling. There's a lot of people sending photos of their homes, photos of their lives to you. And one of the kind of bigger picture, I don't know if theme's the right word, but facets of what I've seen is that there seems to be like a good balance in how you've lived your life, in tying your interests and sort of like your beliefs and your passions into a life where there's not a big divide between here I go to do my work, this is a different thing, then I come home and I live my life here. It's all sort of integrated into just a life.
I never thought of it that way, but I guess that's what I've done. I mean, since I quit being an insurance broker, which I was for 5 years in San Francisco, I got into... I basically left my generation in 1965 and hooked up with people that were 10 years younger than me, like the baby boom generation, because I felt like I had more in common with them than I did with my high school and college friends. And so I ended up working on the Whole Earth catalog. I had built a homestead in Big Sur, and so I got into publishing, and I guess for over 50 years now I've published books on basically just what I've been interested in.
Yeah.
And back at starting out, it was geodesic domes, and published 2 books on geodesic domes. And the second book, Dome Book 2, by the time it sold 160,000 copies, I realized that domes didn't work, and so I took it out of print. And that's when we did Shelter, the book Shelter, in 1973. And then since then I did in 1978. I did Shelter 2, and then I sort of thought I was through with publishing, and I was working as a carpenter and doing some small-scale farming, and I had a back problem, and I saw a self-published book called Stretching, and started doing the stretches, and it solved my back problems. And I called up the guy who wrote the book. It was a book mainly for athletes, stretching before you played baseball or before you ran. And I said, well, what about having stretches for carpenters and waitresses and truck drivers? And so we began a dialogue. And I said, well, how many copies of that book have you sold? And he said, well, he sold 35,000 copies out of his garage in L.A. So, so you interested in doing a book for the bookstores? Yes. And so the authors, I moved to town here in 1979, and we redid the book, did all new drawings, published the book Stretching, and that led me into doing 20 years worth of books on fitness. And Stretching has sold now 3 million copies, and it's in 23 languages. It's in Latvian. Really? And then I did a book called Galloway's Book on Running, because I was a runner. And then I got in touch with a legendary bodybuilder, Bill Pearl, and we did a book on weight training. But all those things were things I was interested in. That's true. I hadn't really thought about it. And then after the year 2000, I got back into doing building books again. And so, yeah, it's all been stuff that I've been interested in. I mean, I have done some books on, like I did a book on tennis, which I wasn't a tennis player, and it didn't turn out so great. And but yeah, I'm just so lucky to have survived for all this time on doing what I found to be of interest in life, and things that were part of my life.
Do you think that there's a potential that your interest is what makes it succeed? Like with a tennis book, if it's not necessarily right in line with your interest, that it's harder to sort of tap the thing?
Yeah. I mean, the tennis book, that came about because my editor at Random House said, why don't you do a book on tennis? She was a tennis player, and so, okay. And so I found this guy. It was really a good idea. His name was Bill Wright, and he was the head coach at UC Berkeley tennis team. They won the National Indoors Championship one year. And we did the book, we called the book Aerobic Tennis, which was not a very good title, but his idea was that you used tennis to get in shape. You weren't just going to try to win. You were going to go out there and run as far as you could, and while you were playing tennis, and also, working out, running and lifting weights when you weren't playing tennis. So it was a good idea. It just didn't come from the heart. And so anyway, after 20 years of doing fitness books, then I got back into doing building books, which is really what I'm kind of passionate about. And so it's gone up until about this stage. And now this stage, the last 2 or 3 years, our sales are not that great. The last book we did, Rolling Homes, was really a good book. It was on vans and pickup trucks and trailers and mobile units that people lived in that could move around. But it hasn't sold that well. And I thought, boy, this is the right time. It's just, in COVID, people are living in vans. And so I'm kind of, now I'm sort of maybe going to angle away from publishing a bit and start, I really want to do Substack. I don't know if you know what Substack is, because it's a way I can get paid for writing. And I have like 20,000 Instagram followers. It's certainly not viral, but it's just like a small town worth of people, and so I like doing that. But it doesn't pay anything. And the blog I've been doing for a long time. Substack's a chance that I have of getting paid, of having people subscribe. So I think that's what I'm going to do.
Your blog would be perfect for Substack.
Yeah. But see, my blog, I used to have a lot of, my blog, it may be that people are not viewing blogs the way they used to because of everything else that's going on now, Instagram, TikTok. And so I haven't had time to do it like I did 10 years ago. And right now I have maybe 1,000 people a day viewing my blog, which is not much. But what I'm kind of passionate about now is, like, everywhere I go in the world, I see interesting things. As soon as I go into San Francisco, look at that, storefront. look at that car, that house, and I take pictures of it. And so I'm going to that's what I'm going to try out now that when I finish the book I'm working on now, which is called Live from California, a book on the 60s and kind of an autobiography. Yeah. And so I want to try Substack and see if I can. You know Chris Ryan? He's
yes,
he's a guy who wrote Sex at Dawn and Civilized to Death.
Yes.
And he's encouraged me to switch over to Substack.
Oh, you know him personally?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's been here a couple of times. He's really he's a great guy. I love his books. His Civilized to Death is really a good book. Sex at Dawn was the bestseller.
Yeah.
And so he's the thing about Substack is it's kind of like a combination of an email and a blog. Mm-hmm. And what I figured out, as everybody else knows this, is that a blog, somebody has to come into my blog. They have to make a decision. They're going to open up my blog. Mm-hmm. I started doing emails maybe a year ago or so, which are kind of old school. But the thing about an email is I send it out to people so they get it, whether they ask for it or not. Mm-hmm. And so I started doing these email newsletters called Gimme Shelter. And I have about 5,000 people on that mailing list. The problem is I haven't had time I haven't done one for like 4 months now. But Substack is kind of like, okay, so you get an email and it says, if you go to here, whatever, here's my latest trip to Manhattan. Here's, the pictures I took and the people I ran into and what I was doing there. Or here's a trip I took to Santa Cruz. Here's surfing at Steamer Lane. Here's the beach at the Wild Hook. Here's my old surfing friends, those of them that are still alive. And so I will, that's my plan. That's my plan now,
No, it's a good interface for emailing and connecting with other writers. And
yeah.
So that your new book kind of ties me in with I was curious when you were mentioning that you were drawn to people who were, say, 10 years younger than you. Yeah. When you were coming up, what was it about the culture at the time that?
It was, okay, so I'm, okay. 1958 to 1960, I ran a newspaper on an Air Force base in Germany. And I got out of the Air Force, and so I had experience with journalism. So I came back to San Francisco and went into the insurance business with my dad and my uncle and my brother. And so I did that for maybe about 4 years until I started smoking dope. And so that was a big change for me because all during, the years growing up, and so I hung out in Santa Cruz. I went to Stanford, and when I discovered surfing before wetsuits, by the way, I changed my major at Stanford to economics because there were no Friday classes. So I would leave Stanford every Thursday at noon and go over to Santa Cruz on my Harley. And we had a cottage on Ocean Street in Santa Cruz for $20 a month. And 4 of us from Stanford shared the rent, so it was $5 a month. And so I spent half the week in Santa Cruz. And so I, where was I going with this? After college, I went into the Air Force for 2 years, ran the newspaper, came back to San Francisco in 1960, and was an insurance broker. And then I started smoking pot in '64, and I kind of looked around at the things that I was doing and thinking that I'm not so interested in this and just making money anymore. And I took a trip. I hitchhiked across the country. Spent about a month just sort of, fucking phone, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and got back to San Francisco and quit my job as an insurance broker. And so during that time, the young people I was interested in all these things. I'm organic gardening, building your own house, communication with dolphins, rock and roll, the blues, the drugs. Not the drugs being marijuana and LSD and mushrooms, not cocaine and speed and heroin, and I found that the young people, the baby boom generation, they were open to all these new things. That they weren't new, but they were newly like organic gardening and farming. It wasn't new, but it was discovered by this large group of people, and so I just found that I had more in common with them than with my high school and Stanford friends, who everybody stayed in the prescribed route, and they're all millionaires now, and so that's why I felt more in tune with the younger generation, and so kind of started hanging out with them, and really changed my life around, and so anyway, skip forward to 4 or 5 years ago. And so I watched what went on in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district. I didn't live there, but I was a better reporter maybe, or a journalist, by not living there and coming in and looking at what was happening. So I guess it was 2017 was the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love. And there was a huge amount of media coverage. There were I have almost 50 books on the subject. There were museum displays, videos, movies, and I didn't agree with much of any of that. That wasn't what I saw happen. So I thought, well, I'm going to write a book on what I saw happen in the 60s. I grew up in San Francisco. I went to high school in the Haight-Ashbury district. I watched what happened. I had a pretty good perspective because I was older generation, and I was, should I go turn that off, that phone off? Yeah. I didn't agree with any of that. Basically, the Summer of Love was a disaster. And here's the timetable. In 1967, in January of 1967, there was what they called the Human Be-In. I don't know if you know about that. It was a gathering in Golden Gate Park. And it was one of those, what you call a sweet spot in time that day. The sun was out. It was a meadow in Golden Gate Park. I think they say 10,000 people came. They had the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane. The bands were on flatbed trucks playing. There was Suzuki Roshi, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, Timothy Leary, all those people speaking. And I wasn't there, but by all accounts, it was just one of those magic days when everything went right. And there were talks, there were Buddhist chants, there was rock and roll, there was poetry. And when it was concluded, Ginsberg said, "Okay, now practice some kitchen yoga and pick up after yourselves." And they left the park spotless. Everybody was so turned on by that. It went, like wildfire. The word went out. There's something magical happening in San Francisco. I was living in Big Sur at the time, and there was a pot dealer who went down the coast giving away all his marijuana. He was so inspired by the BM.
Really?
Okay, so that was early 67. So then in June, the first week of June 1967, they had, a lot of people don't know about this, it was called the Magic Mountain Festival on Mount Tam, which has this beautiful outdoor amphitheater. And they had all the rock and roll bands. Our local rock and roll band from Mill Valley was the Quicksilver Messenger Service. And there was a Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead and the Doors. I think it may have been the Doors' first big concert. Wow. And I don't know how many people came to that, 3,000 maybe. Owsley, the LSD guy, flew over and dropped 3,000 tabs of acid on the theater. So everybody was really stoked by that. 1 week later, was in June of 1967, was the Monterey Pop Festival, which was, I look at Woodstock and, that wasn't the big deal. Monterey Pop Festival, that was the real thing.
That was a big one.
Yeah, and so those three things caused 100,000 young people to come to San Francisco for the Summer of Love. And San Francisco wasn't ready for that. There wasn't food, there wasn't sanitation, There were drug overdoses, and so the Summer of Love, to me, was the end of a very magic couple of years period in the Haight-Ashbury district. And so when all this came about, and so I was getting interviewed 5 years ago by people. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London did an exhibit called, it was I forget what the title of it was, but it was a line from a Beatles song. And they interviewed me and Stuart Brand for a couple of hours. And then there was a really good exhibit at a Berkeley Museum called Hippie Modernism, which I don't think was a very good title, but it was good. It was a good, pictures and memorabilia of the 60s. And so anyway, I thought, and Peter Coyote got interviewed a lot. The Diggers, who were kind of like New York City street guys, came to San Francisco and sort of assumed control. And I thought, well, those guys, they were, that wasn't the spirit of the 60s. So I thought I would write a book about the 60s. And so I've been working on that book for, I don't know, half a year now. And it's become sort of an autobiography.
Yeah.
And so that may be the last book I do for a while. And I don't even know if it's a book I'm going to try to put in the bookstores or not. It might just be for family and friends. I have no idea. I mean, I had fun writing it. I'm happy with it, but it's different from anything I've ever written before. It's growing up in San Francisco, what San Francisco was like in the 40s, the Russian River. In 1955, there were 13 million people in California. So that was when I was surfing, in Santa Cruz, going to Stanford. Now there's 40 million people.
Yeah.
And I get together with my high school friends. Twice a year we have lunch, and I'm the only person that's dropped out. I'm the only person that's got long hair, and not to mention an earring. They're all, I think, Trump backers, but we don't talk about that stuff, and so they're still my friends, and so I mentioned that to one of my high school friends, and he said, well, you know how many people there were in California when we were born? 1935, 5 million.
That's so amazing.
There was nobody around when I grew up. I mean,
Yeah.
we had a lake in the Sierras my family went to. There was never anybody at the lake. And so, so the population of California has grown 8 times since when I was born. And so that's kind of part of the book too, and
Just
so
scale.
yeah. So
That's amazing. I would be really, me personally, curious about a book like that because
yeah,
I've heard so much from that time, and to hear the voice of somebody who's grown up here, was older than the generation that was that it was.
Yeah, I had like a dual perspective.
Yeah.
I think, being, so I could look at it from the point of view of my generation, and but all at the same time, I was in sync with younger people, and so I do have that sort of perspective of what happened, and so that's what's in the book, and also I cover what was going on in the 50s, and then I've got a long, like 4 pages on all the stuff that was new to the masses in the 60s. The organic gardening and the marijuana and rock and roll and building your own house, Buddhism, all the, when I went to Stanford, the one required course for everybody was Western civilization.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't teach us anything about Asia. They didn't teach us anything about the Khmer civilization in what's now Cambodia, or anything about, it was strictly Christianity and European. And so in the 60s, I discovered things like, say, meditation and all of those things. So all of those things were, and so I have a big section in the book. And when I started thinking about astronomy and astrology, a different kind of astrology than the cheap newspaper astrology, all of those things that we discovered then and that were circulating around in the 60s, it was a very exciting time, and it was made possible by the fact that it was so easy to get by on so little money. I mean, in fact, even in the 70s, when Lesley and I were mid 70s, we were, getting by on $300 a month. When I worked at a what turned out to be a hippie commune high school on a 40-acre piece of land in the Santa Cruz Mountains where we built geodesic domes, and so that was a real interesting experience, doing that. And so that's kind of in a way the star of my book was what went on at that high school with 16-year-old kids building their own domes to live in, and what it turned out was that, and so the kids they had the same ideals. They wanted to make a better. Oh yeah, the other things that went on in the 60s were political activism, which I wasn't really part of that because I lived in the country, but the free speech movement at UC Berkeley, and ecological awareness, to treating the planet kindly, and the kids at the high school, they were into those things too, although they were stoned most of the time.
Yeah.
But the first year when we were building was really a good year there, and so that's a really kind of a part of this book that I'm doing that I like a lot, showing that idealism. It didn't last, it's like the Haight-Ashbury district. It didn't last, but the ideals then, they were good ones. They were good ones, and looking back at it, well, I mean, a lot of people think that all that came out of the 60s was drug overdoses and sexual diseases, but there were tons of things that were idealism of the 60s that a lot. I mean, how we could end up with Trump, 50 years later, is just ironic, because we had really the right ideas. Maybe we were naive in thinking of in not understanding how difficult it would be to upset the methodology of doing things. Like we were coming in, and saying that capitalism wasn't the only, that making a lot of money wasn't the only standard. But so anyway, it's one of the things that's interesting to me in looking back at those times was that there were a lot of things that we were right about. That didn't happen. They didn't really happen. One other thing I wanted to mention was that what's really gratifying to me is that people your age but younger than you, 30-year-olds, are looking at the book Shelter and thinking that's something I want to do. I like that, and so it's a whole new audience.
Yeah.
For us, but it's certainly difficult now, to build your own house. That's really difficult, to find the land and to, have the money and all that.
Yeah. And I mean, just the permitting, like
we
were talking about, and just
$50,000, $60,000 for the permits, where my permit was $200, and I was my own. This was 1971. I was my own architect, my own engineer. I didn't have to go through the Coastal Commission. I built a gravity-fed septic system, which has worked for over 50 years, for $3,000. Now the septic systems around here are like $70,000.
It's just uncanny to me how much the cost of life has just skyrocketed, even just in the last 5 years. 10 years.
I have a Mercedes. Okay, I am not the kind of person that would drive a Mercedes. But I found this Mercedes, a 1999 Mercedes 320e, for $3,500 about 2 or 3 years ago, and it is an incredible car. I love it, and I lost a key, so I went to get a key. I called up Mercedes, $700 for a key.
That's
so
nice.
I found a locksmith who did 2 keys for me for $550, but still. Like Billy, my carpenter friend that was just here, he said, these prices, and we're still making the same amount of money. I mean, if you're not working for Google, or if you're not a stockbroker or a lawyer getting $800 an hour, If you're a blue collar worker, the prices are just outrageous. And so I'm just so lucky that we built this house here in our garden. We have a half acre, which, by the way, we covered in a book called The Half Acre Homestead. But I've never had a mortgage. I've never paid rent. And think how huge that is, to people. They think about how much you pay for rent, and I've never paid any rent, and never had a mortgage. And so I'm just lucky that I got in there at that point in history to be able to have this place here,
I cannot even imagine not having paid rent or not having a mortgage.
Well, the point of the building books is that these are things that you can do for yourself, mm-hmm. and you still need your hands. You need your hands to build a house. You need a hammer and a saw. You may use a nail gun instead of a hammer, and you have an electric saw, but still, your computer isn't going to build your house for you. And so those principles are still the same. However, if you're within an hour, 2 hours of a great city like San Francisco or Manhattan or Chicago or LA, you're not going to be able to do it because the codes are going to be restrictive. If you want to go to Nevada or get out in the country, you could kind of still do the same sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And if you have a computer skills and a profession that can be done remote, then you could do that sort of thing. But what I've said to people, okay, in the 60s, we all wanted to have 10 acres in the country and build a house, a log cabin or an adobe house or something, and have a garden. And that's not really what I would advise young people now necessarily. If you can do that, fine. But what about finding an old house in a town or a city in a rundown neighborhood where the crack dealers have just been chased out? And so you got a house, if the foundation is okay, you got a rundown house, you can get it in LA for $300,000 maybe, and you've got wiring and sewage and electricity, sewage, and water. And so fix up the house, and do it yourself. Or if you're living in an apartment in New York City, grow some parsley on your fire escape. But anything that you can do, yourself with your hands is of value, and you have to balance it. It's like a tightrope walk. How am I going to get enough income? The other thing I've thought of recently is saying to young people, okay, work for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, doing whatever you get paid to do, and put aside enough money so that you can live for a year without working, and in that year build a house.
Yeah.
Or get a loft and fix it up to live in. Or just fix up your apartment, but just do anything. It's like self-sufficiency. I realized back then that you can't be self-sufficient. You can't be your own dentist. You can't grow your own wheat, really. There's a lot of things where you need specialization, but you aim towards as much self-sufficiency as possible. Mm-hmm. So do as much for yourself as you can. It's like perfection. You never get there, but you try. You move in that direction. And so that's kind of what I tell young people now. That's what I would do. I'd look in the cities. I'd just do anything that I can. And maybe if I'm working for a tech company, when I was an insurance broker, I went home every night and worked till it was dark building, and on the weekends.
Yeah.
And so do that, and grow some food. You're not going to grow all your own food by any means. You can grow 2% of your own food. That's great. And so that's sort of my message to younger people is now, looking back.
I did that in 2008 in San Diego. I bought a small little. It was like a 750 square foot house. It had been repossessed, bank owned.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a hole in the floor. You could see the dirt down.
Oh, yeah.
The whole thing was in need of work, and that's what I did. I worked
nights
and weekends, fixed it up, redid the kitchen, rerouted water lines, blowtorch, copper, put in a second bath. I had to be really efficient with the square footage, so like taking some portion out of the kitchen to create an extra bath that was connected to the bedroom, that kind of stuff.
Why did you ever move?
Oh, that's a long story, but I ended up working in the Middle East for like 2.5 years.
Oh,
And when I came back, I was just in a very different place mentally, and I was kind of burned out professionally and just a little bit lost. And I sold it and went and lived in Berlin for a while. And
Berlin.
That's when I started doing writing and publishing myself. But
I just went to Berlin. Well, you know, you know what the Biennale Architektura is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 2 years ago, our books were there was an exhibit of our books at the Biennale in Venice.
Cool. Yeah.
And they chose Dome Book 1, Dome Book 2, and Shelter. So they had those books on display. And then they made stick models from the buildings that were in our books. In a very large table, there are maybe 20, 25 little models of these, you know, the structural frameworks of these buildings. And they had it kind of in a landscape, and they had little mushrooms. They wanted to grow real mushrooms because they knew I was interested in mushrooms.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't allow them to do that, so they had these little glass mushrooms. And it was like 300,000 people came to that exhibit, and they all walked past and they had me doing a video on the wall and pictures of our place here. And I got to go to Venice for 4 days with one of the curators of that exhibit, who has become a really good friend, and then a year ago, in October, the exhibit was moved to Berlin by the German Architectural Association, and so they did the exhibit all over again in Berlin. So I got to go to Berlin.
Oh man.
And you know, I as soon as I set foot in Berlin, I thought, man, I love this place. You know, it was. I mean, I'm walking down the street. Berlin's what, 3 million people.
It's huge.
I'm walking down the street in Berlin, and some guy goes, "Lloyd."
Seriously?
Yeah. I've had that happen. I had it happen in Edinburgh. I'm walking down the street in Edinburgh. This young guy with a ponytail says, "Are you Lloyd?" You know. But anyway, just on the subject of Berlin, I could live there. I think, you know. And my friend is a native Berliner. I stayed with him at his place, and anyway, you know. So anyway, it's a great place.
I love that city.
Yeah.
I could live there too.
Yeah.
It's
You go to my blog and type in Berlin, and you'll see my that's what I'm talking about. What I want to do with Substack is look, here's the airfield. Here's you know,
yeah.
And here's you know, here's all the you know, the sights and sounds of Berlin, and you know, so yeah.
It's fantastic. I was actually touching on some of what you were talking about before, politically and just economically. Like with capitalism, I hear there's like a side that just wants to sort of take it all down and start all over, and then there's a side that just wants to ramp it all up and go to this like extreme version of capitalism where it's sort of like winner take all, free
Greed.
market.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think there's a nexus of that kind of tension in what came out of the 60s. But one of the things that I think is important about the 60s are the values that were brought up, is that there are, like, the corporate structure is a legal deed almost that we're allowing for in our structure.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there's ways to make like small changes to corporate law, small changes here and there that could completely embed those values in the structure that we have now.
Yeah.
Where it's not just so rapacious and greed oriented. You know, like in corporate law, you put in let's say a provision that on any corporate board, you have to have members of the community where a business is doing.
Yeah.
You know, so you can't have a company from another nation even, or like another state, come in, set up their power plant right next to you, and they have no concern for the community that they're operating in.
Yeah, right next to a black community or a you know, low income community is what they do. Well, I mean, capitalism can. I mean, look at Patagonia. Look at the that's a capitalist. You know, that's capitalism, and it's well done. Yeah, I don't think you want to throw out the whole thing, but you want to, you want to go in the opposite direction from where we went under 4 years of Trump.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly.
But again, that's not my. I don't really political stuff is it just isn't. I can't do everything, and so that's not where I spend a lot of my time.
I can appreciate that. So was your time in the Air Force where you first were drawn to publishing and writing?
No. I in high school I took a journalism class, and we had this teacher. His name was Mr. Patterson, and he was an ex-Marine, and he taught us, the 5 W's and the 1 H of journalism, supposed to be in the first paragraph, the who, where, what, when, why, and how. And the journalist was supposed to be objective. That's hard to be objective, but that was your that was how you should operate. And so I had that experience, and then I guess what happened in the Air Force was to stay out of the Korean War. A lot of us went into the ROTC, and I went into the Air Force ROTC, and I barely survived it at Stanford, but I somehow did, and I was going to be a pilot on a 3-year flying tour. And so my plan was, I'll go in the Air Force, I'll learn how to fly, and then I'll get a job working on the airlines. And so when I graduated from Stanford, I had about 6 months or so until I was going to go to pilot training school. And in that time period, they found out they had too many of us wanting to be pilots. And so they wrote us a letter and said, okay, we've changed the rules. Now you're going to have to sign up for 5 years if you want to be a pilot. And I thought, well, fuck that. I'm not doing that. And so I wrote a letter to the Air Force, and I said, okay, you guys basically double-crossed us here. I didn't say it in those words. And therefore, here's what I want. I would like to be a public information officer, and I'd like to be stationed in Europe. I don't know how it happened, but they gave me exactly what I wanted. So I went to Sembach Air Force Base in Germany as a second lieutenant and ran the Sembach Jet Gazette, which was, and we actually won an award for the best newspaper on our size air bases 1 year. And so I got that experience doing that, and for 2 years. And I got out a year early, so I got out after 2 years and came back to San Francisco and went to work as an insurance broker. And then 6 years later, when I started working on the Whole Earth catalog, I had that experience. And I guess if I would describe myself as a communicator, really, more than an editor or a photographer or a writer or a publisher. I'm passionate about seeing something going on in the world and then telling other people about it. Almost to the point where when I'm seeing something, I'm going, oh man, well, I'm going to take a picture of this. And so that's what I've done. And that's what I'm saying, that I kind of want to, going from publishing into Substack is, it's kind of like, well, what are you doing going into more social media? And you want me to move closer over here? Or, but this is doing Substack is a chance for me to communicate what I see going on in the world, and so I think of myself as a journalist in a way. When I was in the Air Force in Germany, there was the big newspaper for the European bases was the Stars and Stripes. And so all of us information services officers would go and work for a week at the Stars and Stripes in their desk, their copy, the writing desk. And I found that I couldn't write fast enough. And I figured I'm going to get an ulcer. Daily, or even weekly deadlines just don't work for me.
Yeah.
And even a magazine, so that's how I backed off into where, okay, well, I can do books where I don't have a deadline. I don't have to even do a book a year. And so that's kind of my experience with it's it's my own kind of journalism, but it's journalism, and it's just such a terrible shame that, like Fox News calling what they do news.
Oh, that's
They're just a rotten money making anti-journalistic setup.
yeah.
So
No, well now it seems like those outlets, I don't know, it's like the New York Times now goes after the whistleblower as opposed to reporting on what they're.
yeah, the New York Times. I mean, I read the New York Times practically every day, but still, I have a lot of. I also read the Intercept, the Guardian. I've got a way to get into the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, and Fox News. I look at Fox News every 3 times a week or so, just to see what they're doing. And where do you get Slate is a kind of a good one. The Guardian is maybe the New York Times they do a lot of stuff. They've got a particular point of view, and so it's you kind of have to thread your way through.
It's hard,
the news and to find out what's really going on, if there is such a thing.
Yeah. Politically, I mean, understanding that it's not like I don't know, it's a weird terrain, but I'm getting to the point where it's so hard to trust, to know what's going on and to trust who's speaking.
Yeah.
That I almost feel like rather than organizing based on ideology, it's almost a point where we have to organize based on principles of how we engage.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like if your politics cause you to turn on your neighbor, then it's a bad politics.
Yeah.
So we don't operate that way. Like there's an agreement. We don't do politics where we turn on our neighbors.
Yeah.
And almost have procedures for how we work together as opposed to ideologies that we're squaring off in.
Well, I mean, but how do you tell what? I mean, I'm not sure that I really know what's going on in Ukraine. From the New York Times,
Exactly.
I mean, I've got people who send me things from Counterpunch, which are completely different. And this guy's saying, well, the United States helped topple an elected Ukrainian government.
Yeah.
And NATO, blah blah blah. And so I don't know. I'm but as I say, my life is so full right now that I don't spend a lot of time, with political thoughts.
Yeah.
And trying to figure it out.
I think that's wise. Was the communication the fact that you are motivated more by communicating with people, was that one of the things that brought you to the Whole Earth catalog when you first started?
No, I was living in Big Sur. So when I quit the insurance business, I'd been building on the weekends, and I built a house of bridge timbers in Mill Valley, and an architect came and saw it and offered me a job building a house on a 400-acre ranch in Big Sur out of bridge timbers. He had bought all the timbers of a bridge from the Duncan Mills Bridge on the Russian River, redwood, 8 by 22, 16 feet long.
Whoa!
So he had this job in Big Sur it was called Rancho Rico. It was a 400-acre ranch. It had its own 2 beaches of its own, and the site was on a hilltop. And so we moved down there in probably 1967 maybe, and I fixed up a chicken coop. We lived in a chicken coop, and I brought 2 brothers with me, Paul and Seth Wingate from Mill Valley. I was the foreman. I made $4 an hour. Paul and Seth made $3 an hour. And I worked for about a year on that job until I got into a dispute with the architect, and I quit and went and built my own house down near Esalen. And all during that time, I was learning all these new things, all these things that came up during the 60s. And I was even subscribing to the LA Free newspaper, whatever it was called, the LA Underground newspaper in Big Sur. And I was learning about organic farming and all those things then. And I started building domes, geodesic domes, when I finished my house, and I got the mathematics from Popular Science published an issue where they showed a geodesic dome greenhouse, and the mathematics were there. So I got the math and built the dome, and people started writing me for the mathematics, and so I would answer them, and I thought, well, I'm writing the same letter over and over again. Why don't I just mimeograph something up and I'll just send that out? And I thought, well, while I'm at it, why don't I put in about Rodale's Organic Gardening Magazine and these Ken Kern's Owner-Built Home and other things that the Sears Roebuck catalog, which was really useful if you were out there, homesteading. Yeah. I'll throw all those things in, and about that time I met Stuart Brand, and he was ahead of me. And I thought, okay, I'll join forces with him, and so that's how I got into it, and I became the shelter editor of the Whole Earth catalog and learned how to make books, and then borrowed the facilities of the Whole Earth catalog, their typesetting machine, which was it was an IBM Composer, was what it was called. It was a $9,000 typewriter, and Polaroid camera, which those were the two things we used to put books together for the printer. So I learned how to do that working for Stuart, and then did Dome Book 1 in 1970, Dome Book 2 in 1971, and all of a sudden I was a publisher, and have been ever since.
Yeah, this touches on, so I want to get back to just the idea of working with your hands.
Yeah.
Because I think it's just a very valuable aspect of life.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something about being able to work in space, to build something, to put materials together.
Yeah.
It has a mental, psychological value.
Yeah.
I think I don't know, just they're your hands, you're making it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how long have human species has been around for, 50,000 years, and that's always been, part of, until very recently. We were physical, we had to be physical. And then with the Industrial Revolution, things started changing. And usually, what I learned working with all these athletes for those years on fitness books was that basically, you go to college and you're sitting all the time, and then you get a job and you're sitting, and then you lose touch with the physical aspect of life. And so working with I miss it now. I wish I could, when I get a chance to do something like to make a table or to, do any of the many things you have to do to keep a homestead working, I really enjoy that. Like yesterday, this year I've gone back to collecting firewood on the road from oak trees that fall down. So yesterday afternoon I went out with a chainsaw, and it just feels really good to do that physical stuff. And I think it's good for anybody to do it, to try to work it into your life, and to use your hands.
Was that something you've understood and appreciated, like going back to your earliest days?
Yeah. Well, when I was 12, my dad built a house up in the Sacramento Valley near the town of Colusa. He had a rice farm, and so we would go up and work on weekends. And my job was to shovel sand and gravel and cement into the concrete mixer, because it was a concrete block house with a concrete slab floor, and that was okay. It was hot, And then, but the clincher for me was when the walls were up and we were putting on the roof. And they gave me an apron, carpenter's apron, and hammer and nails, and I got to nail down the sheathing on the roof. And I still remember that morning, the smell of the wood and the hammering. The hammering thing is really good, and the feeling of accomplishing something. Like when I have built places, the most wonderful moment for me is when I get the floor on and I step up on the floor. And here's this floor that wasn't there before. And so I've just loved working, and when I quit the insurance business in 1965, I got a pickup truck, and I loved going to lumber yards. The smell of the wood and the workers, builders are like farmers. Like, I have never met a farmer that I didn't like. Yeah. They have to deal with real things. They have to deal with the wind and the rain and all these things that a lawyer and a stockbroker and an insurance broker don't those things don't matter. and so they're practical, and so I found that was a real relief to me to be, doing those kind of things after 5 years wearing a suit and going into the city and being a businessman.
It's easy to not appreciate how much work goes into the world that we move through.
Yeah.
Just all the built things that we just take for granted.
Mm-hmm. Like one of the things I find that with my friends, we are interested in the way things are put together. Like you're looking at something and, well, could I do that? Or could I fix that? How do I fix this thing? Or how do I make this work? And a lot of the, I've for 50 years now, I've been interviewing builders and people who do work with their hands.
Yeah.
And we're all interested in, the same things. How does that work? How do I, my mirror on my car is screwed up. How can I fix it? Or, how do I make a device to do something or other, which is fun. But it's a common thing among people who build.
Yeah.
How things are put together.
And when you are putting together a book, you're also laying it out by hand, right?
Yeah, I do it. It's the old school, new school kind of thing. The way I do a book is I gather material for quite a while, and I'll keep files. A lot of it, say if it's contributors to a book, say like Rolling Homes, I'll have folders, email folders. So I'll end up with maybe 30 different emails going back and forth with this guy who converted a lorry into a home in the UK and drives around, and then I'll have photographs. I'll keep the photographs, and so at the same time I'll print out stuff and keep it in folders in the, that's real old school, in a drawer, and then when I get enough stuff together, not in any order, I'll start doing layout, and I'll pull out the folder, I'll print out the text in maybe 2-column and 3-column. I'll print out the photos, maybe 6 photos on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and I'll lay those out in front of me, and I'll adjust the size of the photos on this cheap copy machine I've got here to what I want, and I'll tape them down onto the layout sheets with removable Scotch tape, and I'll draw stuff in, and and so I do all that without. You can do layout on a computer, in InDesign, but I want to do the layout without having to follow the exactitude of a computer. And maybe because in a computer and InDesign, so you'll take a photo and you've got your text on the side, you'll enlarge the photo and it'll automatically adjust the size of the text. But I like to do that stuff by hand and listen to music, maybe smoke a little pot or use gummies now that I don't smoke anymore, and a cup of coffee. And so I do that, and then I get the pages ready, and then I give them to Rick, who makes adjustments in Photoshop to the usually required, and does the layout in InDesign, and gets it ready for the printers. And then we FTP the files to the printer.
Yeah.
And we generally will print out the entire book on our Epson stylus printer. And we send that to the printer and say, these are the colors we want, and so it's an analog way of doing layout in a way.
Yeah, very tactile.
But it takes a lot of time to do that.
We in the landscape architecture world, we do a lot of that. Actually, it's going digital. But
Use CAD.
We do a lot of hand.
Mm-hmm.
There's a principal that he's so good, but he's been in the profession he's probably been in the landscape architect for like 40 years or something. Mm-hmm. But he does a lot of that he'll cut and collage ideas, and we do a lot of layers of taping things on trace and running it through copy machines. And there's something about working, even doing something that will ultimately be a digital image. Working with hand.
Yeah.
It allows, I don't know, for me, I find it much more easy to get inside of an idea when it's physically in front of you than trying to work on a screen and do.
I think that's kind of true with everybody if they just, knew how to get there or how to use those processes.
Yeah. Yeah. So also then ideas about home. I don't know. To me, that you've been involved in homesteading going back, into the 60s. Was was your interest in sort of like in in building homes and pursuing these different projects, like these different, I don't know, like you're here in Bolinas, you had lived in Santa Cruz down out also outside of Esalen, and then you were on the commune. I'm just curious if it was if there's a community thing, like if you were coming to homesteading through like a desire to form a community,
No,
or to form your own place in the world, or just taking advantage of opportunities that came.
I just needed a place to live.
Yeah,
and I mean,
very simple.
if I'd been able to, in 1960s, if I'd been able to find a house in Mill Valley that was, that I could afford, I don't, no, I liked building, but no, it's just a place to live, a place to have shelter, and it turned out that if you did do it yourself, you figure maybe cost of materials and labor are maybe 50-50. So if you can use your own labor, you're cutting your costs in half.
Yeah.
And you get the satisfaction of doing it, and you get the satisfaction of having materials that you like to live with, which, I've found that the materials, like natural materials like wood and adobe and stone, feel better to be around than more processed materials, and say like plastics, especially plastics and metal. But like right now, I kind of combine things like the place that I recently built is half of the siding on the exterior is metal, is a used corrugated roofing, and then used wood on the upper part of the building. So that, and I discovered this with straw bale houses that with my friends Bill and Athena Steen, who are the straw bale people who live in a area near Tucson. And in their house, there was just this wonderful feeling that somehow I got from those walls of straw that I don't think you wouldn't get if you were, say with a concrete block, or especially plastic.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Well, they're thick walls then too, right?
Yeah.
There's something about that too, just the
and floors that are made out of soil.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw a house in Japan where they had a whole soil ground that was that like came up into their kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they would just dump their leftover tea on the ground, after having their tea. It's very neat. Yeah. I can see that being in this climate, a very feasible option.
But I found that say, and usually the materials from the area where you're building are the right way to go. Like if you're on the West Coast here, where we have a lot of trees, it makes sense to use lumber. If you're in the desert, it makes sense to use adobe. Mm-hmm. If you're in an area where you have a lot of rock, and that's kind of the way to go, I think. And stud frame construction is really quick, and that's kind of what I've come around to doing, where I live. And staying away from abstract concepts, and like I want to build a dome based on an icosahedron, or I'm going to have a 7-sided tower, or I'm going to have an elliptical or a freeform. If you do that, you can do it, but it's going to take you 3 times as long and cost 3 times as much money. And what I want to do, I want to get a house built and live in it, and then get on with my life and not spend my whole life creating a work of art for shelter. And so that is one of the things I learned. And with domes is that don't start out with a abstract concept that's going to be difficult to bring into reality, but look around where you're building, look at the farm buildings, and see what, they have to pay attention to the weather and wind and all that sort of thing.
What was it about domes that you said didn't work?
Well, if anybody really wants to know, I did when I took the dome books out of print, I did a thing called refried domes, and it was all the reasons that I thought the domes didn't work. And if you go to our website, which is shelterpub.com, and scroll down to the bottom and click on domes, there's a pretty big section there on why they don't work. They tend to leak because water flows over the entire surface. The fact, if you want to add on to a dome or subdivide them inside, it's really difficult because you have to tie into all these different angles. If I want to add a room on, if I have a wall here and it's vertical, if I want to add on to it, I just put a roof off of it and another wall. If I want to add on to a dome, I've got to tie into this angle, that angle, that angle. You have to use, tend to use, plastics and metal. You're cutting up your structural members like 2x4s, whatever, into 3-4 foot sections, which aren't reusable. But anyway, it just goes on and on.
Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I've got stuff coming up here, so can
we?
Yeah.
I guess the last question I just wanted to ask was about home.
Yeah.
Because there's the structure itself, there's the concept, there's your place in the world, and also just sort of tying in with the idea, or just the sense I'm getting of pursuing your interests and making your life around it. Some aspect of that is sort of like there's a component of home to that. So I'm just curious your thoughts on making a good home and what makes for a good home.
Well, materials, design, and somebody like Lesley, who's the captain of the ship here, and and the feeling you get, and how you decorate it, and if you have rugs on the floor. You have Dwell magazine, which is one aesthetic, which I understand. That's not my aesthetic. Our place is more like a farmhouse, with a lot of things, and a garden being part of it. And it's such a very basic thing in the human history, human existence, that people walk into our house and they like it. It feels good because it's just because it's everything that we put there, all the the decoration and in the kitchen, the pots and pans hanging up, and the function of everything. But yeah, the home is a really important thing. It's your base. It's where you're going to sleep, and you're going to eat, and you're going to heal when you're ill, and your center. Dwell magazine is everything is very clean, and there's no nothing on the walls, and I don't know who all those people, and it's a much more popular. Dwell magazine is hugely popular compared to our more rustic stuff. So, I guess we're outnumbered, people like you and me. I sometimes think of, my followers as being people like I don't know, you ever see Fahrenheit 451, the movie? It's a movie about a time in the future in, like Germany or something, where books are outlawed. They burn books.
Yeah.
And so there are a group of people, rebels who love books, and they have committed to memorizing one book. And so they meet on the outskirts of town, and there's this scene of them snowy, walking around in the snow, memorizing, Ulysses or The Sun Also Rises, or these books. And so maybe we have a tribe of people who are not interested in having the slick, super expensive house, but are more interested in something that feels good and is warm and comforting, and so maybe it's a small. I think it must be a much smaller group of people who like the sort of things that we do, than modern, minimalist architecture. So if you look through our books. And the book that Lesley and I did called The Half Acre Homestead. That's okay. You want to know what I think about a home? Here it is.
Yeah. I'll be sure to check.
There's
that
500
out.
pictures in there of what our home is.
Yeah. Well, it's beautiful. It's I thank you for letting me come and talk with you here.
Yeah. Okay.
And thank you for talking with me.
Okay. All right. You're welcome. Okay. That's good.